Hello. Now that you know a little bit about how the Constitution was brought about, it's time to talk a little bit about the structure of the U.S. government under the Constitution itself. In this first talk, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but instead I'm going to give you an overview of a few themes around which the Constitution is organized. The first of these is the separation of powers and the system of checks and balances. And then I'll talk about how the Constitution enumerates powers for the various branches of government. Then we'll talk a little bit about federalism and how that works as a form of government. And finally, about the Republican form of government and what exactly that means. The first theme I want to talk to you about is the separation of powers. Now, you might remember that the separation of powers was Montesquieu's idea. Montesquieu's fear was that government could actually pose a threat to the basic rights of human beings. And one of the ways in which he thought that that threat could be reduced was by dividing the amount of power that any government held between different groups, so that those groups would check one another's potential abuses. In the case of the U.S. government, power is divided into three branches. The first branch is the legislative branch. This is where national laws get made. Our legislative branch is particularly interesting in that it's divided into two houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. We'll talk more a little bit later about why there are two houses and what the roles of each house of the legislative branch is. The second branch is the executive. The executive branch, based in the White House, is the President of the United States and a Vice President. But it's also their staff, sometimes called their cabinet. Lots of people have to work for the executive branch, but the person who gets elected is the president. And that branch's job is to make sure that the laws of the country are enforced. The third branch of government is the judicial branch. The judicial branch essentially runs the court system of the United States, and their main job is to ensure that the laws of the country are interpreted in the same way by everyone, ensuring that the laws are applied fairly. The second theme I want to talk to you about is the system of checks and balances. This is more Montesquieu. The idea is that no one part of the government should be able to act completely independently. So each area of government, each branch, has a way of affecting the other branches and what they do so that they're dependent on one another. Here are some examples of that, and I would strongly advise you to spend some time checking out this chart because it's a fairly handy way of looking at this. But the basic way this works is that the legislative branch is checked by the judicial branch because when the legislative branch makes laws, the judicial branch can, if it has to, declare those laws unconstitutional and therefore unenforceable. Meanwhile, the legislative branch also checks the judicial branch because when justices are appointed to the Supreme Court by the president, the legislative branch can actually vote down those appointments if it doesn't approve. Similarly, the executive branch can check the legislative branch by vetoing bills. Now, vetoing a bill means to say, that law you just made, I, the President of the United States, do not like it. You have to go and debate that topic a little more and make a better law. The legislative branch can override a veto, but in order to do so, they need a 2/3 majority, which is very difficult to get. So, in this way, the lawmaking power of the legislative branch is checked by the executive branch and by the judicial branch. The power of the president to appoint Supreme Court justices is checked by the legislative branch. And of course, the fact that the president appoints justices in the first place gives the president power over the judicial branch. These are just a few examples of the ways in which each branch of our government is checked and balanced by the other branches. We'll get into this in a little more detail as we continue with the presentation. The third theme I want to talk about is the enumeration of powers. To enumerate something is just to list those things. So in the case of the U.S. Constitution, the Constitution lists the powers of each branch of government. Now, we're going to get into what the enumerated powers are in a later part of this presentation. But for now, what you basically want to understand is that enumerations are just lists. So the legislative branch can make laws, approve presidential appointments, raise taxes, declare war, and so on. The executive branch can run the army, sign and veto laws, and pardon people. The judicial branch can decide what cases to take, can rule laws unconstitutional, can settle disputes between states. The enumeration of powers is important because the way the Constitution is set up is that any power not specifically listed as belonging to a branch of the federal government belongs not to the federal government at all, but to state and local government. This is another way in which the power in the United States government is divided. So let's take a look at how that division really operates. Okay, the next theme I want to talk about is federalism. We've talked a lot about federalism already, and you kind of have the sense that the federal government refers to the national government, which is basically right, but federalism should be understood as the idea that you have a group of states, and those states each have their own governments, but those governments are all ruled over by one larger federal government. So it's an organization that is controlled from the top. Under a federal government, the national government is the strongest government there is. In the Constitution, that idea is protected in something called the Supremacy Clause. Nevertheless, a federal government does divide powers between the national government and state governments, and that is another way in which tyranny is prevented, because we want to make sure that the national government can't do anything it wants and the state governments can't do anything they want, so as best to secure liberty and prosperity for all Americans. So, the national government has certain delegated powers, and among those are maintenance of the military, power over war, the ability to make treaties, the establishment of a postal system, standards for weights and measures, control over currency, and control of copyrights and patents. State governments get to establish local government, like town meetings and mayoral systems. They also get to set up schools and set their own regulations for schools. They get to regulate state commerce within their own borders, make the rules for marriage, and establish and regulate corporations. Where I think it gets interesting is when national government and state government both share certain powers. So, for example, both the national government and the state government collect taxes and establish courts. They both have rules about the regulation of interstate commerce and banks. They can both borrow money. They both can have programs to provide for the general welfare, which means to provide services for people or help them to pursue happiness and health. And both the national and the state governments are able to punish criminals. But one of the things that you should think about is that the division between national and state government is sometimes left a little vague, and sometimes there are even pretty big questions that aren't answered by the Constitution, such as, can a state, if it really doesn't like what the national government is doing, secede? Can it just quit? Another question that some people had, although I think this is actually answered in the Constitution, is, can a state government just ignore what the national government wants it to do? Ignoring what the national government wants you to do is called nullification, and we'll see some of that in the run-up to the Civil War. I think, though, that strategy of ignoring the federal government's requests and rules is actually unconstitutional. And the reason I think that is that there's something called the Supremacy Clause. And the Supremacy Clause explicitly states that the powers of the federal government are always going to trump the powers of state governments. So whenever there's a conflict between what the national government wants to do with its constitutionally mandated powers and what the state wants to do, the national government's going to win. So, for example, if the national government says we're going to have such and such a regulation for banks, and the state governments don't like those regulations, the national government can actually trump state power and make sure that those banking regulations are enforced, because that's what supremacy means. All right, one more thing about federalism. One of the interesting pieces of having a federal government is that the federal government has a few ways in which it can expand its powers to give itself a little extra push against state governments. So one of the places that that's going to exist is something that you've already heard about, which is the elastic clause, or the necessary and proper clause, and this happens in Article 1 of the Constitution. The elastic clause says that the federal government can make all laws which are necessary and proper for carrying out its foregoing duties, which means anything that it needs to get done. And so what you need to understand is that elastic clause really means that sometimes the national government can make laws that are not in its sort of expected list of powers. And those laws can be enforced over and above state governments. In addition, there's something called the Commerce Clause. And you might think that the ability to regulate commerce between the states really isn't that big of a power for the national government. But it turns out you'd be wrong about that, because virtually any law that the national government makes could be said in some way to affect trade. And because of that, the federal government is able to make all kinds of laws about things like education or taxation or how businesses are allowed to operate that might seem initially to be something that really only the state governments should be in charge of. But over the years, the power of the federal government has expanded because of the way that it's used the Commerce Clause. All right, enough about federalism. Let's look at our last theme. Our last theme is the idea of a republican form of government. That's right. The United States of America is not a pure democracy. We instead are what's known as a democratic republic. And that works in a variety of ways. So let's make sure we understand, first of all, the difference between a pure democracy and a republic, or representative democracy. In a pure democracy, all the people vote on laws and issues. This is pretty much the system that the ancient Greeks used in Athens. Democracy comes from two words, demos, meaning mob, and kratos, meaning power. So, democracy means mob power. Now, you might be thinking, that kind of sounds like the Greeks didn't entirely trust direct democracy, and you'd be right about that. They were worried because sometimes groups of people get really agitated about things and make decisions in a hurry that aren't the best. Direct democracy is very vulnerable to this kind of mob mentality decision making. There's also a lot that to be concerned about in terms of large majorities of citizens controlling the events of some particular area. This is the problem of faction that Madison discussed in Fed 10. You can avoid this problem of faction and this problem of mob rule in what's called a republic. So in a republic, people vote for a representative, and the representative has to represent the people that put him in power, or her in power, of course. These people who vote for the representatives are called constituents, and they're the people who the representative is responsible to. Now, the nice thing about a republic is that the representatives can work together, they can spend time making themselves experts on legislation, so they can make really well-considered decisions. And because they are responsible to many constituents, in theory, they can avoid that faction problem of Madison's because there will be many different types of people who each representative has to be responsible for representing. The only problem with a republic is that, in theory, it's possible for the representatives to abuse their power and not always treat their constituents with respect. So, as in all things United States, we actually have a compromise. The federal government is pretty much a republic. Both the House and the Senate have representatives who are sent from the states and elected by the people. The president is also elected by the people. And so all of those rulers are the type of representative you'd see in a republic. But at the state and local level, you often see much more democracy. So, for example, in the state of Massachusetts, we have a referendum system. So occasionally, citizen voters get to vote directly on certain laws or issues. In addition to that, in local government, you often have things like town meetings. Now, town meetings are still somewhat Republican in that the people who go to town meeting have to at least get their names signed by enough of their neighbors that they're allowed to go there, so they're technically representatives. But town meetings are pretty big, and they're largely open to whoever wants to come. So, a town meeting is pretty close to an example of direct democracy, still in action in the United States. And that's why the United States is a democratic republic, incorporating elements both of pure direct democracy and Republican representative democracy.